Anemoia. You're scrolling through old photographs of a street you've never walked down, a decade you never lived through, and something in your chest tightens anyway. The light in the photo feels warmer than any light you've stood in. You find yourself missing the sound of a record player you've never owned, aching for a summer that ended before you were born. This is called Anemoia, a nostalgia for a time or place you've never actually known. Psychologists describe it as borrowed longing, built from stories, films, and photographs rather than lived memory. Your brain doesn't need first-hand experience to form an emotional attachment, only enough repeated exposure to a mood to make it feel personal. The past becomes something you inherit rather than something you lived. Saudade. You think of someone who is still alive, still reachable, and yet you miss them the way you'd miss the dead. It isn't sadness exactly. It sits somewhere between grief and gratitude, a fullness and an emptiness at the same time. You smile while your throat tightens. This is called Saudade, a Portuguese word for longing that carries both the joy of having had something and the ache of no longer having it. Researchers studying emotion note that saudade blends memory with anticipation, a wish for something to return even when you know it won't. It's love that has nowhere left to go, so it turns inward. Natsukashii. An old song plays in a store and you don't feel sad at all. You feel warm, almost proud, like greeting an old friend rather than mourning one. The memory arrives fully formed and gentle, no grief attached. This is called Natsukashii, a Japanese term for a fondness toward the past that carries no pain. Unlike Western nostalgia, which often leans bittersweet, this feeling is closer to comfort. Psychologists studying cross-cultural memory suggest that how a culture frames the past shapes how the body experiences remembering it. Some people are taught to miss what's gone. Others are taught to simply be glad it happened. Involuntary memory. The smell of rain hitting hot pavement pulls you instantly into a memory you hadn't thought about in years. A specific afternoon, a specific version of yourself. You didn't try to remember it. It simply arrived, whole and vivid. This is called involuntary memory, sometimes referred to as the Proust effect, after the writer who described a childhood flooding back through the taste of a small cake. Smell bypasses the brain's usual filtering system, connecting directly to the regions responsible for emotion and memory. That's why a scent can undo years in a single breath, faster than any photograph ever could. Rosy Retrospection. You think back on a job you once complained about constantly and somehow only remember the good parts, the laughter, the friendships, the little rituals. The stress has quietly disappeared from the story. This is called rosy retrospection, the tendency to judge past experiences more positively than you judge them while they were happening. Memory doesn't store events like a recording. It reconstructs them each time you recall them, and each retelling smooths the edges a little more. The version you remember is rarely the version you lived. Reminiscence Bump. Songs from your teenage years feel sharper, more alive, more yours than anything released last month. You can recall the exact moment you first heard them. This is called the Reminiscence Bump, a well-documented tendency for people to recall memories from adolescence and early adulthood more vividly than memories from any other period. Identity is still forming during those years, so the brain treats everything happening then as significant. Déjà vu. You walk into a room and everything suddenly feels like it's happened before. The conversation, the light, the exact angle you're standing at. It lasts only a few seconds, but it feels certain. Undeniable. This is called Déjà Vu, French for already seen. One leading theory suggests it happens when a new experience is processed slightly out of sync. The moment feels old simply because it was labeled that way a fraction of a second too early. Jamais Vu. You stare at a completely ordinary word, one you've written 1,000 times, and suddenly it looks wrong, foreign, like it can't possibly be spelled that way. Your own street starts to feel unfamiliar halfway down the block. This is called Jamais Vu, the opposite of déjà vu, where something deeply familiar suddenly feels brand new. It tends to happen with repetition, when a word or scene is processed so many times that the brain briefly loses its sense of recognition. Familiarity, it turns out, is something your mind has to keep actively rebuilding. Déjà Rêvé. A moment unfolds and you're struck by the strange certainty that you've dreamed this exact scene before. Not lived it, dreamed it. The feeling is quieter than déjà vu, more private, harder to explain to anyone else. This is called Déjà Rêvé, the sense of having already dreamed something that is now happening. Because dreams and memories are stored using overlapping neural pathways, the brain can sometimes confuse a half-remembered dream for a genuine premonition. The past you're recalling may never have happened at all, at least not while you were awake. Fernweh, you're looking at a map or a photo of a place you've never been, and an ache opens up in your chest, a longing to be somewhere else entirely. It isn't about escaping your life. It's a pull towards somewhere specific, somewhere you can almost picture. This is called Fernweh, a German word meaning a longing for far-off places, sometimes translated as the opposite of homesickness. Psychologists note that this kind of longing is often less about geography and more about identity, a wish to become the version of yourself that only exists somewhere you haven't been yet. Yūgen. You're standing in fog or watching light move through trees, and a feeling rises in you that has no clear cause. Quiet, vast, almost sacred. You can't name what moved you, only that something did. This is called Yūgen, a Japanese aesthetic concept describing a profound, mysterious sense of beauty that can't be fully explained in words. It isn't about what you see, but what the scene suggests lies beyond it. Some feelings, this concept argues, are meant to stay just out of reach of language. Mandela Effect. You remember a detail with total confidence, a movie line, a logo, a spelling, and then discover you're wrong. And stranger still, that thousands of others remember it exactly the same wrong way. This is called the Mandela Effect, a term for shared false memories held collectively by large groups of people. Researchers link it to how memory is reconstructed rather than replayed, meaning small errors can spread and reinforce each other across a culture. When enough people misremember the same thing, the mistake starts to feel more real than the truth. Hiraeth. You're somewhere comfortable, even happy, and a quiet ache surfaces anyway, a longing for a home that may not fully exist anymore, or maybe never did. This is called Hiraeth, a Welsh word for a homesickness for a place you can't return to, or one that was never quite real. It isn't grief for a location so much as for a version of belonging that time has since dissolved. The home you're longing for was never just a place. It was a feeling attached to a moment that's already gone. Sehnsucht. You feel a restless longing for a better, more complete version of your life, one you can almost picture but never quite reach. It isn't about anything specific, more a pull towards something just beyond your grasp. This is called Sehnsucht, a German term for an intense yearning for an ideal or alternative state of existence. Psychologists describe it as a life longing, a sense that some unlived version of your story is still waiting somewhere out of view. Vellichor. You walk into an old bookstore and something about the smell, the dust catching light, the worn spines, fills you with a strange, wistful melancholy you can't fully explain. This is called Vellichor, the peculiar wistfulness of used bookstores and the countless unread lives sitting quietly on their shelves. Each book holds a former reader's fingerprints and forgotten thoughts, a small trace of a life you'll never know. The feeling comes from standing this close to so many stories that stopped being anyone's present. Kenopsia. You walk through a school hallway after hours or an empty amusement park at closing time, and the silence feels heavier than silence should, almost haunted. This is called Kenopsia, the eerie, forlorn atmosphere of a place that's usually full of people, but now stands empty. Your brain expects motion and sound in these spaces, so their absence registers as unsettling rather than simply quiet. The place hasn't changed. It's your memory of how it should feel that makes the emptiness so loud.